Thank you for joining us tonight live with Christine McMillan. My name is Sherry Tuvell. I am with Families First Funeral Home, and thank you. Especially after the day you've probably had shoveling your driveways and such. We really appreciate you taking time to be here. Please know you're not alone. This is something that you're dealing with others. You may not see them because you're in your homes right now, but look below and you'll see the number of people joining us, and you are together with people, with friends. And please feel free to leave comments, ask questions for Christine. She will take a look and try to address them at the end. This is a really difficult time. We have COVID going on, as well as all of the other types of sudden deaths, and mental health has never been more important. The solitude of being away from people and not having that physical hug, that physical support that we're so used to needing by nature as human beings can make things really tough. So Christine's going to help you equip yourself with some modes and thoughts and processes that will help you guide you through the moments and the days, and just take your time and be kind to yourself as you would be kind to others. So thank you, Christine, so much for being with us tonight and helping to offer support and a little bit of ray of sunshine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and thank you too to Families First for continuing to bring these presentations to the bereaved in our community in Windsor and Essex County. Good evening, everyone, and I am Christine McMillan, and I want to thank you very much for joining us remotely for tonight's presentation. Tonight we're going to talk about grief after a sudden death. It's a pretty heavy topic, and we're going to get through it, but I'm going to start with taking us back a year. Almost a year ago, COVID entered into our lives without warning, and it changed how we live dramatically. And much like the grief process that enters into our life, sometimes unannounced, certainly with a sudden death, it lingers much longer than we would like it to be, like an uninvited guest. Also, like the grief process, we need to allow the COVID experience to unfold, just like the grief process. It needs to unfold in its own timetable, and we need to continue to practice patience as it follows its natural course. So as we get started, Arthur Toynbee said there are always two parties to a death: the person who dies and the survivors who are bereaved. And I presume that you who are joining me are either bereaved by a sudden death, or you're supporting somebody who's been bereaved by a sudden death. The job now is for you to learn to live in this world without your loved one. So when we talk about sudden deaths, what are we talking about? Have a look at these different types of sudden death. As you can see, a sudden death comes about from various causes. However, a common feature of a sudden death is that it occurs with no or very little warning. It's unexpected. We usually say a sudden, unexpected death. It's that proverbial knock on the door or telephone call. We can also add to this list a quick death after a diagnosis, again, when there's no time to prepare. And in this climate right now, we can also include COVID deaths, or deaths complicated by COVID, where there's no preparation, and in some cases, you weren't allowed to be with your loved one. So while it can come from different causes, the common feature is that it was sudden and the bereaved had little or no warning at all. There was no time to prepare. Before we talk about what grief is all about, let's look at some general facts about grief. The first thing is that no two people are ever going to grieve the same way. While there may be commonalities in the grief process that I, as a clinician, will be aware of and look out for, I've yet to meet in my 20 years 2 people who grieve and mourn the same way. There is no correct way to grieve either. Don't follow any stages. Whatever you experience, and it's your unique experience. Now, having said that there's no correct way to grieve, there are certain things that you have to do, but anything is pretty well normal within the parameters of harming yourself or anyone else. And time frames are very individual. Many times I'm asked, how long will this take? And unfortunately, I have to say, as long as it takes. As long as you're doing your grief work, and we will be talking about that. Bereavement is one of the most stressful events in one's life. And the death of a loved one is rated at the top of a very well-known stress scale. So, there's no timelines. Every experience is unique. There's no wrong way to grieve, as well as there's no stages. It's not linear, it's not neat, it's not tidy. It will come to you in waves. There's no pattern. Certainly if we anticipate a trigger, that will affect how you process it, but we can't predict when grief will overcome you. It's very fluid and it's constantly changing. One moment we think we've got it, I can handle this, and the next moment we could be down sobbing. However, mourning is what's needed to process what's happening to us. That's the act of expressing your grief feelings outside of yourself. But as we'll talk about later, we do live, unfortunately, in a mourning avoiding culture. We try to move you away from your pain because we don't like to see you in pain. Certainly your loved ones, your friends, your family. And that really derails, it has the potential to derail the naturalness of the grief process. There's no end point. So I'm also asked, when does it get better and when does it end? That's not to say how you're feeling right now is the way you're always going to feel. What we mean by that is that grief doesn't end because love doesn't end. What happens to the grief process, it won't be so heavy and burdensome when you do your grief work. It'll soften, it'll change. It'll become easier for you to manage because you've done what you need to do, which is mourning. We will always carry our grief. Or as one mother said, I will always be dancing with the grief after the death of my child. Yes, it is part of your life, but you'll be able to recognize it as the process unfolds, and you'll be able to manage it. There will be periods in the future when your grief is going to tap you on the shoulder to try to get your attention. We call them grief bursts or grief embraces. It can happen years later. There's nothing wrong with that. It's completely normal and it's natural. Because what happens as we process the grief, while we never forget, which is impossible, we don't focus on their absence as much. And then every so often it'll come to our consciousness, it'll come to the surface, and it'll tap you on the shoulder. That's okay. That's actually normal. Because as I said, we will never, ever forget our loved one. Grief is also unpredictable, disruptive, and very confusing. So while there's no pattern, no two people grieve alike, it is very disruptive. However, it's also a normal and natural process. Again, in our mourning avoiding culture, we don't approach it that way. We don't think of it as being a normal process. We think there's something wrong with us when we become emotional, or we emotionally withdraw, or we experience feelings that we're not accustomed to. But this is a natural process because you were attached to your loved one. And what grief is, very simply, a form of our separation anxiety. And after a sudden death, which we're going to talk about soon, is that it's a very unique form of separation anxiety because the death came with no warning. That psychologically impacts the bereaved. It doesn't make the death more difficult than an anticipated death. We just know clinically that there are certain things are very common in a bereaved's grief journey if their loved one died suddenly or quickly after a diagnosis. So, what do I mean by grief? I just said that it's a natural response that happens to us after we're separated from an object of our attachment. It's a form of separation distress. And it affects us, we usually think it affects us emotionally, and it certainly does. However, some people are more emotional and some people are less emotional. Not everybody needs to cry, but I would say that underlying sadness is very common when you're separated from a loved one. So you might experience sadness, profound yearning, searching behaviors. You might experience irritability, anger. You might experience jealousy or envy as you watch friends carry on with their lives. You might experience blame or guilt or resentment. Anything that you experience, while it may not be common or you may not be comfortable with it because you don't identify it as part of your personality, it's actually quite normal. What you need to do is acknowledge it, feel it, and then in time you can release it. Because any feelings and emotions that are not expressed stay frozen inside of you. So, we do know that grief affects us emotionally. What other ways does it affect us? It affects us physically as well, because grief is equal to stress. And we know that we hold stress in our bodies. Our sleeping could be disrupted. Our appetite could be disrupted. Our chronic conditions could be exacerbated because of the stress. We could have chest palpitations, tightness in our chest, backaches, headaches. Again, all very natural. So we do have to look after ourselves physically as well. And I recommend to all my clients, especially soon after a death, that they do see their physician, or again, under these circumstances, you might have a video call or a telephone call. First of all, to let them know that you've experienced this huge stressor in your life. And we want to make sure that any physical responses you're experiencing now doesn't have any kind of organic basis to it and is related just to stress. And again, once you do your grief work, you should see the your normal routines start to stabilize. Grief also affects us cognitively. Grief takes up a lot of bandwidth in the brain. And it's experienced by things like disorientation, confusion, difficulty with decision making. That's why we recommend do not make any major decisions in the first 6 months or even a year after a death, because we are not thinking clearly and we're motivated by our feelings. It disrupts brain functioning. There have been neurological tests done that show that. It also affects us socially. We may emotionally withdraw from people. It affects our motivation level. It affects our sensitivity when we're around other people. And it also affects us what we call spiritually, and not religious, but more in terms of why did this happen? How could this have happened to me or to us or to them? It'll call into question your philosophical views about the world, that the world is good, that I'm a good person. So grief affects us on these 5 realms. And as I said just previously, there's no logic to it. It flows, it's fluid, it's dynamic, and whatever you experience, you experience. There's nothing that you have to experience in order for you to feel you're doing your grief work. However, with a sudden death, we bring in this component of trauma. And what I mean by trauma is any event that we're faced with that kind of overextends one's coping strategies. So what might be a trauma for one person may not be for another person. However, generally speaking, when we're talking about a sudden, abrupt death of a loved one, it has definitely a traumatic component. So I want to spend just a few moments talking about traumatic events. So they're extraordinary occurrences, not that they rarely happen, but that they overwhelm the person. The person at that moment doesn't feel like they've got the capabilities, the skills, the ability to withstand and sustain themselves through this trauma. Generally, a traumatic event involves a threat to either self or someone you love. It usually involves violence or death of some kind. So what is important is not the event, but the meaning that the person attributes to the event. So what we see with a traumatic event, or in this case, a traumatic, sudden, unexpected death, is the shock, which is expressed as terror, the intense negative reaction, which is the horror of what you perceive your loved one went through. And this is very important in a sudden death, is the sense of helplessness. Because many sudden deaths are perceived by the bereaved as being preventable. Not that they are preventable, but that they're perceived of being prevented. So you've got shock, intense negative reaction, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. I'm just going to grab a water here. So now we're going to talk about what are the unique characteristics of a sudden death. As I said earlier, a sudden death isn't necessarily worse for the bereaved or more painful. It's how it's experienced. But clinically, we know certain things are seen when someone's experiencing a sudden death. So the sense of unreality, the shock, the numbness is more intense, and we see it lasting longer clinically. And that shock and numbness and that sense of denial, of unreality, is actually a really important component of this process, because we would not be able to tolerate the full impact of our lives changing so drastically in one moment. So just like a physical trauma, where the body goes into shock, protects the body, our psychological shock is just that. It's a shock absorber. So what we see is that it stays for a longer period of time. But eventually, that shock and numbness do dissipate, and we do have to face that reality. So as a bereaved person, bereaved by a sudden death, you may function well. You may get through the first 6, 8, maybe 12 months, and maybe not even actually started to deal with the reality. You were also denied the opportunity to say goodbye with a sudden death. You may have been with your loved one, but you didn't get the chance to say goodbye, as we might get with a death after an illness. And that's certainly the case with COVID-related deaths. Even though it's a result of an illness, many family members have been prevented from being with their loved ones. And also with a sudden death, we see the increased need for information, more information. And that only makes sense. If there was no preparation, you weren't with your loved one, you want to know more. You want to know more than how they died. Who was there? Why did they die? Who was involved? Were they alone? Could it have been prevented? That's also a very normal reaction. Do you recall I said that grief is really a form of separation anxiety? We do know that other than profound sadness, anxiety is a huge component of grief. And in this case, we can liken it to fear. How am I going to carry on living? What if something else happens? And with a sudden death, because one moment your loved one was here and the next moment they weren't, our autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight response, will be elevated. And then there's also a sense of helplessness. Well, I couldn't save my loved one. What can I do if something happens in the future? Also with a sudden death, you're denied the opportunity to prepare practical events, practicalities of life. If you've lost your spouse suddenly, or the earner in the family unit, there was no time to prepare. We also see an intensified physical reactions. That's also very common because, once again, it's a shock to our system physically as well as psychologically. Then we also see time distortion. We see time distortion with other types of grief, but it's more intensified with a sudden death. It's as if time is rushing by or it stood still. When did I last see him or her? When did I talk to this person? We see physical and emotional withdrawal, very often not wanting to be around other people. And that's a way for us to absorb this reality. It's a way for us to recharge. It's a way for us to allow this shock to seep into us. In many of the deaths on the slide at the very beginning of the presentation, there's shame and stigma that can be attached to it. And that adds another layer to your grief experience. And with shame and stigma, you might find that you don't talk about the type of death. You may not get the support that others would get. Again, questioning, why him? Why her? Why now? If you're a believer, you believe in a higher power, you may start questioning your higher power, even if your faith is very strong. And guilt and blame is very, very common with a sudden death. Because as I said, it's a sudden death is somehow perceived as being preventable. So as a loved one, you are going to review, what did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? I should have known better. I shouldn't have let them do that. And this is all part of the mourning process. So none of this is wrong. It's very natural, but it's highly distressing and very painful, but this is the process that the bereaved have to go through. In certain types of death where another person was involved, in a homicide, in an assault that leads to a death, in any type of car accident or fire, if somebody else was involved, emotions, anger could escalate to rage and thoughts of retribution. Now, while anger in and of itself is not a negative emotion, it's part of the human spectrum, there is healthy anger and unhealthy anger. So we certainly don't want anger to escalate to rage and you getting caught up in retribution. There's intrusive thoughts and images, even if you didn't see your loved one die. Sometimes that can even be worse clinically. It can present as worse for the bereaved because sometimes our imaginations can run away with us. And certainly in the case of a homicide or certainly even a suicide, anything that has to be investigated. This is a complication also in your grief process. The involvement with the media, the police, the criminal justice system. And generally what we see is the bereaved trying to do their grief work. And grief work, bereavement is about missing the person. But it always gets derailed because of the legal system or the criminal justice system. So it's another layer that further complicates and makes the grief process more complex. And what we also see is that a sudden traumatic death, it has the potential to impact how you as the loved one view the world after this death. It changes your perception, how you operate in this world. We generally think that the world is benevolent, it's meaningful, and that I'm worthy to live a good life. And those things can be shaken after a sudden death. We all have 5 basic needs. the need to feel safe, the need to trust someone other, the need to feel some control over one's life, the need to feel of value and to value others, and the need to feel close to others. And so what these things do is when those needs are met, they act as buffers that help us to cope with life. However, a sudden death undermines these needs, and the buffer is then gone, and you feel helpless. You might feel alone. You might feel like you don't have an anchor point any longer. George Engel said, "The loss of a loved one is psychologically traumatic to the same extent that being severely wounded or burned is physiologically traumatic." So the process of mourning, which is feeling your feelings, your sad feelings, and giving them expression, is then parallel to the process of healing a physical wound. You wouldn't want to interrupt a physical wound from the natural process of healing. You might be impatient with it, but you will follow orders. You will do what's necessary for that wound to heal in the best way. And yet we don't do that when it comes to our broken hearts. So what exactly am I talking about when I talk about mourning? As soon as a grief feeling, a thought is expressed outside of yourself, it becomes mourning. Because then it doesn't stay inside. You may revisit those emotions and those thoughts, and I'll almost guarantee you, with grief, and certainly with grief after a sudden death, you will be revisiting the whys, the what ifs, the anger, the guilt. You will revisit them. It's okay, it's normal. The important thing is that you have the courage to do that. And when you start expressing it outside of yourself, it becomes mourning. And that's what facilitates the grief, so that it softens and that it'll be easier for you to bear and to carry. So some of the ways that we can mourn is by talking, is by crying, is by writing. Anything that brings what's in here or up here that I'm thinking about out into the open, we give it light. You can do it individually. You can do it with a therapist, a counselor. You can do it with your best friend. You can do it in a support group. You can do it in a journal. You can do it by art and by music. There's no one way to mourn. The more ways you have that are accessible to you, the better it's going to be. But this is what's needed in order for you to heal the psychological wound. But the problem is we don't know how to deal with it. As a culture, we move you away from it. We give you, as Dr. Alan Wilfeld says, hurry up and get well messages. How are you doing? Are you better yet? Are you back to work? Keep busy. They wouldn't want you to feel this way. And so we fall into step with that. We distract ourselves, we avoid it, we deflect it, we numb ourselves from it, we withdraw, we hide from it, we sweep it under the rug, instead of having the courage to face it. So, if you take away one thing, is that grief happens to you, it's normal. Mourning is how I get through it. So here are some tips in terms of when you might want to look at getting some professional help. And if you're early in the grief process, this doesn't apply to you necessarily. I'm referring to maybe a year later, 2 years later. So if you find that the grief is worsening, and it will feel a little worse before it gets better. If you find that your yearning and searching is unyielding for your loved one, you're still kind of in a suspended state of disbelief. And that's seen in behavior and things like using the words is as opposed to was. That's very common early in the grief process. But as time goes by, we need to understand and let that reality sink in. If you're preoccupied with the death and you find that you're not able to engage in moments of present moment living, if you continuously go to familiar places, or you continuously avoid potential triggers. Obviously, if you're experiencing persistent and mounting depressive feelings, that's certainly very important, and that needs to be addressed medically. Again, if your anger and your bitterness take hold and you're feeling enraged, you're not going to be thinking clearly when that happens. Self-destructive behavior, destructive thoughts, suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts. And certainly if you're misusing or you're abusing controlling substances. Anything that's done to excess, where you're not going with the flow of the grief process. The grief process comes in waves so that it challenges you to do your mourning when the grief overcomes you, but then it subsides for that moment and it allows you to pick up life. And if somehow you choose not to, or you're not able to, even if your motivation's low, then you might want to seek professional help. Iris Bolton wrote My Son, after her young son died of suicide. She says, I don't know why, I'll never know why. I don't have to know why. I don't like it. What I have to do is make a choice about my living. Now that doesn't come quickly. That state of mind doesn't come quickly. It doesn't come easily. It comes after a lot of pain of the grief work of mourning. So how do I get through this? How do I put one foot in front of the other? Early in the grief process, and that could be anywhere from 6 to 8 months. We're not talking weeks. Okay? You need to breathe. Literally and figuratively breathe. You don't have to do anything unless it's a time-sensitive issue. And most likely you've already done all of that because you were in shock. And that's what shock and numbness and disbelief at the beginning of the process serves, that function, so that you can make decisions and you can do things that are time-sensitive. Once that wears off, once the frenzied activity surrounding the funeral ritual has eased, we subconsciously think we should be feeling better. But your process is beginning. And so I want you to keep it simple. And I want you to just breathe. And I want you to put one foot in front of the other. and do moment by moment living. Because grief affects our bodies and our minds, you need to implement a self-care plan. Engage a friend, another family member, to help you to come up with a self-care plan. Make yourself accountable to them that you're going to do it. That includes trying to eat well, drinking lots of water. You need to engage in some form of physical activity. So while grief can physically fatigue us and tire us, it also gives us that energy, that anxiety that I've spoken about. And that has to be expelled. So right now, bundle up, get warm, take the dog out for a walk. Do something to get your body moving. And even if you don't want to, I still want you to do it. Make a commitment to do that. Attend to your spirit too, in whatever fashion suits your personality. And have that courage to mourn. That's what takes courage. It's not about saying you're okay. It's not about showing your vulnerability. It's about feeling that pain. Your loved one is worth that. Continue to ask your questions. Many times clients will say to me, I beat myself up over it. And so we pull it apart together. Let's go over it again. Why do you think you could have prevented it? How could you have prevented it? We can't do this alone. We need other people to get through this process. We're meant to have people support us. Sadly though, with COVID restrictions, if you've lost someone during this last year, you've been prevented from having the community support you. So find ways that you can ask people to help you. Reach out for help. And when people offer, be humble enough to accept it. Also adjust your expectations. Do not compare yourself right now to how you were functioning before your loved one died. Think of yourself as having a physical wound, a physical injury. So adjust your expectations. Because if your expectations are unreasonable, then you're adding another layer of stress to the process. Dose yourself with your grief. As I explained, it naturally, normally comes like this. So while we would like it to be predictable, it isn't, but the waves come and the waves soften. Eventually the wave will ease. And you can release, and you can focus on here and now. So dose yourself with the grief. Very slowly, try to reestablish your routines. Now, this is counterintuitive because our culture says, get back to normal, keep busy. You need routine, but do not busy yourself so that you don't feel. What do I mean by don't waste your grief? Well, don't sit there and wait for it to get better. Because just like a physical wound, if you don't tend to it, it won't get better. Your grief is the cost of loving. And while your loved one died suddenly and traumatically, and you might still be reeling from the shock, they also deserve you to mourn them. Have patience with the process, please. It will never, ever go as fast as you want it to. It doesn't. It's not on our timetable. But we can do certain things like doing our grief work, mourning, to facilitate the process. And seek professional help. Make sure you're on the right track. Make sure you're heading in the right direction. If you've got any questions about how you're feeling or some of your behaviors, they could be quite normal. depending on the circumstances of the death or when your loved one died. And when you become overwhelmed, because I guarantee you will, go back to the basics. Go back to self-care. Before that, go back to breathing. Deep, square breathing. And that's in for 4, hold for 2, and out for 4. Slow down your autonomic nervous system. Ground yourself. There's lots of grounding techniques. Trust that you can handle it. And lastly, believe. You have to believe. You have to set your intention to get through this. And while it may waver at times, you need to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And at some point in your grief journey, I don't know when that's going to be, you must come to the point of relearning the world. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean learning new information. Unfortunately, you have learned new information about yourself and the world. But what I mean by that is learning to live the best life you can in the absence of your loved one in this world. How do you learn to live? Not now. Now is your job is to mourn. And as you mourn, you'll find your grief responses soften and lighten and dissipate. You'll find your energy levels coming back. That does happen. And then you will have to make a choice. How do I go on living in this world without my loved one? My 3 wishes for you as you do your mourning, as you ask and receive help, as you take care of yourself, is that you find a way that you are able to live with the whys of your loved one died. As a clinician, I can't tell you why. I can't give you the answer. No one can give you the answer. In some cases, there might be a medical reason. But I think we're talking about the bigger why. And only you have to explore that question over and over again until you're able to settle into an answer that you can live with. And I hope you find ways to honor your loved one. Do it after you've done your mourning. That's your first job, is self-care and mourning. And then try to find a connection to your loved one and honor them. And I hope you continue to have the courage, the strength, serenity, and some peace as you go forward after this trauma. I will end with this quote: "Have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. Don't search for the answer which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. So live the questions now. Perhaps then someday in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer." I wish you all the best as you journey forward. Have the courage to fully mourn the precious person in your life. I thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully we can gather soon in person if we continue to have patience with COVID and follow the rules. So I wonder, just before we end, if we have any questions. Nothing, no questions. So perhaps I've answered the questions. I hope so. Families First is here to support you in your grief journey. You can certainly access my information if you'd like any type of one-on-one support. Thank you so much, and I wish you all the best. Good night.